The Yoon administration's plans to reconsider its raising of weekly work hours made international headlines this week, as did several events related to Korea's entertainment industry. So what was the gist of the coverage on Korea's work hours? What economic issues were of interest among the foreign media? And what are pundits saying about Korea's planned largest ever live fire drills with the US? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. It's that time of the week during which we touch upon the stories related to Korea that also made headlines elsewhere. For this, I have Andres Sanchez Braun here in the studio with me. Andres, welcome back.
Always a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
I also have Nicolas Rocca with us. Nicolas, it's great to see you again.
Good to be back.
Right, Andres, despite the grave instance here on the Korean peninsula, we'll start on a light note today. Let's start off on the entertainment front. A Taiwanese daily this week covered the huge spending by Blackpink fans after a concert there in Taiwan. Could you tell us a bit about that?
That's right. Girl band Blackpink actually held 2 concerts in the southern port Taiwanese city of Kaohsiung. The concerts were on Saturday and Sunday, and they altogether drew like 90,000 people, which is a lot of people, as you can imagine. And then local authorities had a very good idea. They decided that they would exchange the ticket stubs from the fans for a voucher worth around 50 Taiwan dollars, which is not a lot of money. As you know, it's like around 2001, $2. Not a lot of money, but enough to buy a snack at Taiwanese famous night markets, right? So 2 local markets in Kaohsiung, Ryohae and Roifong, actually reported huge crowds until the wee hours. And some stall owners were reporting an increase in sales from 20% or even double. So I think this just paints a nice picture of how K-pop can draw huge crowds, and what is actually more important, the economic activity that it entails, right?
Right. And Andres, broadly speaking, your industry insiders are forecasting a further expansion in global K-pop events market within the next decade. Could you tell us a bit about that as well?
That's right. There is a report that came out by made by Allied Market Research. This report actually estimated that the K-pop event market was worth somewhere around $8 billion back in 2021. They forecast that it will actually reach $20 billion by 2031, so in the next decade. What the report basically points out is that, after 2 years where the industry took a huge blow because of the pandemic, because either, concerts weren't being held or people just simply refused to go out of the fear of getting COVID, now the industry is actually recovering very steadily. So the main takes, for example, it says that ticket sales still account for pretty much of the revenue generated by K-pop events, but that sponsorship is actually steadily growing, and that's actually where the real growth potential apparently lies. Also, it is a boy band driven industry so far. The report actually says that around 3/5 of total revenue is generated by events linked to boy bands, not to girl bands. And then by region, North America is the largest region in the world by revenue for K-pop events. It takes up like 1/3 of the total revenue. But the report points out that it's actually going to be Asia Pacific. That's going to be the area that is going to drive all the growth for the next decade. And actually, this resonates with what Bang Si-hyuk, the CEO and founder of Hype Label, the label behind superpower band BTS, actually said this week at the Kwanhoon Journalist Club. He actually pointed out that he was worried about the growth in the American market seems to have stalled for K-pop. So he was actually calling out for the industry to not, don't feel, guys, don't feel comfortable, have a sense of crisis. And he actually said, it would be good for South Korean labels to consolidate and to make super really big entertainment groups in the sense of like a chaebol, you know, like Samsung Electronics, for example, and try to take over bigger chunks of the global market. So, of course, very ambitious words coming from someone like Bang, right, who's proved to have very interesting ideas for the industry.
Right, a very ambitious plan right there. Nicholas, also on the entertainment front, an Argentine newspaper recently touched upon 10 Korean actors that Latin America should know. Do tell us a bit more about that, and do include your favorite if you have one.
Well, I think it touches upon, you know, the global influence of Korean culture in Argentina. My colleague from my radio broadcast in Buenos Aires always asks me questions about how can the Korean culture be so big, and he notices this influence, you know, daily. There's even National Kimchi Day in Argentina. It has been voted by the Senate, so that tells a lot about the influence. Coming back on that list of 10 actors that Argentinians should allegedly know, I think what's interesting, it shows that the actors that are in the list are praised for their work on platforms, on Netflix dramas, usually Netflix dramas. Even though they've been, I mean, famous for a while, like for instance, Son Ye-jin, that has been famous in Korea for a while. They mostly, you know, underline her acting in Crash Landing on You. Lee Jung-jae, for instance, also that has been a huge star in Korea for a while. They mostly focus on Squid Game, and I think it shows like the global influence that you know, Netflix has, and Netflix has for Korean drama. When it comes to my favorite, I would say that the performance of Park Eun-bin in Extraordinary Attorney Woo was, I think, yeah, very surprising, new to me, and I think that, you know, it brought to light the subject of how autism is treated in the society. So when such a performance, you know, goes over the drama and becomes like, you know, the talk of the town in society, I think it says a lot. And I think there's also you know, Song Ye-kyo that is actually in The Glory right now, that show that Andres seems to really appreciate, because he stayed up last night to watch the 2 episodes as the second part is streaming now.
I still haven't finished it, and I'm really enjoying The Glory, I have to say, yes.
What part are you watching right now?
I'm about to finish the second part, so I'm almost there.
Right, I see.
Not yet.
You know, as strange as it sounds, I have yet to start though. Ooh. But I'm so looking forward to it. I think this weekend then. Oh. Nicholas, I'm going to, right, I'm probably going to enjoy it. Nicholas, borrowing the words of director Bong Joon-ho during his acceptance speech at the Academy Awards back in the year 2020, do you believe subtitles are still perhaps 1-inch tall barriers against efforts to better indulge in K-pop, not just K-pop, of course, K-content in general? I mean, based on your observations from those around you, what can you tell us?
Well, I think those observations were directed maybe towards the American audience that is widely known to, you know, not be very curious for contents that were made outside of North America and the US generally. It's also, you know, a small barrier for other countries that are not English native countries. But I would tend to say, talking with, you know, my friends in France that don't know much about Korea or never been to Korea, I think they're getting more and more used to hear Korean because, you know, of the success of K-pop, different dramas. So I think this barrier for a lot of countries or for a lot of people is becoming, you know, less and less important. And also the younger generation, I think, is used to see contents from everywhere in the world. And I think Bong Joon-ho has always been, you know, in favor of discovering cinemas from everywhere in the world. He was actually in France last week giving master classes and talking about the importance of discovering cinemas from everywhere in the world, talking about his own influence, how he grew up watching, you know, movies of Alfred Hitchcock or Clouseau, and how important it was. So I think maybe this barrier still exists, but it's becoming smaller and smaller.
Right, of course. Andres, let's now turn to social issues here that made international headlines. CNN covered the Union administration's plans to rethink the 69-hour work week. What was the gist of that coverage? I understand you also covered it as well, right?
Yes, I did. Maybe not too extensively, given that there were a lot of news stories last week. But yes, basically, as you know, well, they covered the story of how the plan apparently is being redrawn right now because of the apparent rejection from trade unions and especially young people that have not liked the idea of you know, the cap being raised so that you can work longer hours. But I think what CNN in this case did, and other global media, including Spanish media, the point that they've made is how Korea seems to be moving in an opposite direction compared to, for example, Europe. Europe, for example, we have the case of the UK, as CNN mentioned. Actually, lots of companies since the pandemic have been trying the 4-day week, the 4-workday week, and actually have seen their production, remain at the same levels. So basically, the point here, in Spain, we have a 40-hour cap. In France, it's even lower. It's 35-hour caps. But we've managed to actually maintain the productivity levels. We haven't really required higher caps. This said, of course, these caps are sometimes very indicative, especially when it comes to professions like journalism. We don't really have, as a journalist, I've never actually had anything similar to a 9-to-5. It's just basically, the news guides your work-life balance. But the point here, I think, is interesting because in Spain, this system has been in place since 1919. There was a huge strike by a public electric company back then, and since then the government set the cap at 40 hours. I think it's important to understand, and the numbers show it, Henry Ford himself actually decided in the 1920s, he was the first big American businessman to actually realize that, if I establish a 5-day week, working day week, I actually make my workers happier and more efficient because they work less hours, they're less tired, and they're more motivated when they come to work. But also there's an interesting point to ideas like the 4-day week, which is, for example, that you actually give people the opportunity to spend more money on leisure. So it actually is positive for economical activity. So anyhow, interesting how this coverage was many global media was interested in seeing how Korea tries to apparently walk on the opposite direction in this sense.
Right. And meanwhile, Nicolas, beyond Korea, staying with labor, though, I understand public protests persist there in France as French President Emmanuel Macron seeks to raise the retirement age regardless of the discontentment among the workers there. Could you tell us a bit about the situation there?
So it's a pretty sensitive topic for French people, but I think there's as you mentioned, there's an overwhelming amount of French people that are against this reform. I think if the protests are so big, it's probably the biggest we've had in France for decades. It's for a multiple amount of reasons, but if we take the reform, as you mentioned, it will raise the legal age from 62 to 64, but more importantly, I think in the mind of most French people and French workers, is that you will have to work in total more to have a full pension. So the consequences are that, for instance, women that will lose some year of activities if they give birth, for instance, will have to work more in the end, and they are going to be more penalized than men. The other sector types of person that are going to be affected is the people that started working early, 14, 16, and those people are often the ones that have more physical jobs, that is more tiring on their physical health. So I think that is one very important point of the reform that French people don't, around 70-75% of French people are opposed. And there's also internal politics factor. We just had an election. The president doesn't have a large majority, actually not even a real majority at the National Assembly. So he had to use some specific aspect of the constitution to put the law going forward. There was no discussion with trade unions. All that with the rise of the cost of living. All that creates, and also I must admit the quality of French people when it comes to protest and striking, that is well known. So all that put in a mixer, it kind of creates a situation we're in that is, I think, quite unique. What it says more broadly maybe was the relationship of French people to work. People in protest that were interviewed, they were pointing out the fact that, since we created the pension system in France, I think it created an idea that there was a time between the end of your work life and before your death that you could focus on yourself, your family, your loved ones, and it felt like the president in a way was taking part of that right away, and that didn't go well with the public opinion. And what Andres said about the relationship maybe each country has with work, with life-work balance, I think for maybe South Korea and South Korean population have a very different view on that, but probably this difference is getting thinner as we witnessed that the so-called MZ generation in Korea was clearly opposed to President Yoon's 69 hours work week reform. So I think those questions around the world of having a healthy work-life balance is a global preoccupation.
Right, especially in the aftermath of this pandemic, of course. Andres, on the economic front, there has been some media coverage about Korea's plans to build the world's largest chip center with investment, of course, from Samsung Electronics. Could you tell us a bit about this ambitious plan?
Yes, actually, this plan pretends to establish this hub. Right, this big hub with 5 main facilities that are basically going to be foundries for semiconductors. The main investment would come from Samsung, which is, the world's largest memory chip producer, and the investment, I believe, amounts to something like a 300 billion won. That's a lot of money. The place chosen is Yongin, which is already an area where Samsung and SK Hynix have very important facilities producing semiconductors. So the basic idea is that once you establish these new foundries there, starting now and up until the next 2 decades, when this whole project is finished, you will have attracted around let's say 150 companies, both Korean and foreign, and mostly fabless ones, which means companies that design semiconductors and need them printed. So this is what this huge facility is intended to do. And I think the important part also here is to understand why this is actually going to become the largest semiconductor producing area in the world. Yongin, which is south of Seoul, is basically very close to other areas that already take part in the semiconductor industry. So we have, Hwasong, we have Pyeongtaek, we have Pangyo even, we have Icheon. So all this huge network, I think the minister of industry put it this way, like we're going to have the whole value chain of semiconductors in this whole hub area. So I think a really, really interesting project, and also very positive for Korean companies, I think, at a very difficult moment because of U.S.-China tensions, and especially after the Biden administration passed these bills that can punish, companies that, for example, transfer know-how or technologies to Chinese companies within a certain time frame. Both SK Hynix and Samsung are vulnerable technically because they both have facilities producing semiconductors in China. They have been exempted, as Washington already said, and apparently they're not going to be as harsh as initially thought. But it does, give an idea of how difficult the whole environment for these companies is turning out to be. So the fact that now you're actually trying to build some very important capacity at home, in Korea, maybe is actually a important point of relief for the semiconductor Korean industry, actually.
Right, and staying with what Andres has just said, Nicholas, the trade ministry here, speaking with Reuters, it did respond to U.S. restrictions on business ventures in certain countries. This would be including China, in the case of receiving U.S. subsidies. Could you tell us a bit about that, and how do these restrictions look to affect European chip makers as well?
So basically, the Korean Trade Ministry said that it won't affect the factories of SK Hynix and Samsung Electronics in China. But I think the broader implication, and it's what Andres kind of touched upon, it's the difficult position Korea finds itself in with, this real will from the US side to decouple China from the whole semiconductor making process, make this, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, US connection. And also the will for, the biggest South Korean semiconductors company to pursue some activity in China. I've heard that, Lee Jae-yong will go to China actually tomorrow, I guess, until Monday for an important visit, for an important forum. The chairman of SK Global will also go there. So it shows that there's still an intention, to find a solution and to find this kind of middle ground for a South Korean company that they need. When it comes to Europe, I think the influences is going to be way less important because of the fact that Europe is not the most important, European countries are not the most important actors when it comes to semiconductor, and it's something EU countries have, been trying to focus on. There's investments going on in Spain, in France, in Germany, in Italy, in order to try to change that and to be less dependent on that very valuable and sensitive resource that is semiconductor now. I think the main impact that it had was on a Dutch company, a company in the Netherlands, ASML, that produce key machines in the process of building semiconductor, and that announced that they will stop exporting this knowledge. So I think that was the big influence for Europe.
Right, it was. Andres, on the security front, there's also been a bit of coverage about plans by South Korea and the US to conduct their largest ever live fire drills this coming June. Could you tell us about that?
Yes, that's right. The US and South Korean troops will conduct what they have called their largest ever live fire drill in June. The reason for this, there's basically two reasons. One is to commemorate the 70th anniversary of the Mutual Defense Treaty, which was actually signed between South Korea and the US in October of 1953, after the end of the war. The reason it's actually being pushed to June, it's because it's actually closer to the date when the armistice that put an end to the Korean War was signed. So the other apparent reason, as the Ministry of National Defense put it the other day, is we're going to do this in the light of the increasing number of weapon tests being conducted by the North Korean regime. And, just today we've seen new developments with North Korea announcing a new type of weapon, apparently a torpedo, guided torpedo, or underwater drone, if you might call it that apparently has the capacity to generate a nuclear tsunami. But this all, after 2022, we had, North Korea conducting a record number of weapons tests. We've had both South Korea and the US conducting huge drills again, and right now we have the Freedom Shield command post drills, which actually finished yesterday, but we still have the Warrior Shield field training ongoing. That's going to last until early April, and we're seeing that North Korea is responding with more and more weapon tests. So I guess, unfortunately, we might have to expect a big response in June, because as Seoul put it, this is going to be the largest live fire drill ever, and we have to point out that this kind of drill has only been conducted around 10 times since the end of the Korean War. So let's see what happens.
Right, I see. All right then, well, that's all the time we have today. Andres, as always, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts. And Nicholas, thank you very much for your insight today. Right, well, that ends this week's editions of Issues and Insiders. Thank you for watching. Have a good weekend. See you same time next Monday.